we're now here with Ben Fong. He teaches at Arizona State University, also the author of the forthcoming book, Drugs in American Capitalism. That will be out from Verso next year. And his most recent piece for Jacobin is The Psychedelic Renaissance is on the verge of an uneasy enlightenment. We're linking that down below. Ben, how are you? It's good to see you.
Good. Thanks so much for having me back.
So let's just dive right into your article. You have obviously written about psychedelics for Jacobin, and sort of course, in the context of mental health, right? So thus far, we have quite a few drugs on the market that are used to treat mood disorders. I think SSRIs are sort of the big ones, and they have gotten kind of mixed reviews over the years, as you point out in your article. Now, of course, a growing number of mental health professionals are now touting the benefits of certain psychedelics like ketamine, LSD, MDMA. I'm sure everybody has seen the trend pieces about people microdosing acid and so forth. And something that you note in your article is that, obviously these drugs are all illegal, right? But it does seem like some mental health professionals are sort of convinced that that is going to change very soon. So maybe just to begin, maybe give us kind of the lay of the land of psychedelics. Is it really the case that there is, so much scientific evidence for the efficacy of these drugs as kind of, mental health, the mental health benefits of these drugs, that you think that prohibition is going to be sort of overturned in the next couple of years?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's two parts to that
Hmm.
question. Like, one is about the efficacy of psychedelics, and like one is about like the reasons for which prohibition is going to be overturned. So, just
Right.
to tackle the first part, this actually has a pretty long history. I think that when most people think of psychedelics, they think of the sort of countercultural '60s. And in our cultural memory, that's certainly most prominent. But there was a sort of more underlying tradition, starting in the 50s and going into the 60s until Prohibition, that was interested in those drugs more as drugs of therapy. The basic idea being that LSD, psilocybin, mescaline could lower the boundaries of ego defense and thus speed up the sort of therapeutic benefits of psychotherapy. There are a lot of people really interested in this research. They were at the time disgusted with a lot of the excesses of the counterculture and really upset when prohibition came. And some people sort of lamented the fact. Some people sort of like turned away from psychedelics altogether. There was a solid band of true believers who kept the flame alive over the years. They sort of congealed around an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. And MAPS funded, much of the sort of key research that's responsible for the psychedelic renaissance. So they, behind the first sort of LSD study in like over 40 years in Switzerland. They were behind much of the psilocybin research for depression and anxiety, the MDMA research for PTSD. So they've really been pushing this forward. And so, yeah, it has a long tradition. In terms of their efficacy for psychotherapy, there are different modalities within which it's used. So I would say it sort of depends on the modality. Some people sort of just think of it as like like a pill you take every once in a while, or an infusion or a treatment that you do every once in a while. Some people much more explicitly tie it to the process of psychotherapy. So it's less about the drug and it's more about the talking that is curative. So
Hmm.
it depends on what modality you're talking about. That all being said, to now get to the second part of your question, I don't think that the reason that these things are going to be legal soon, and I do think that they will be legal, has anything really to do with their curative potential. I think it has much more to do with addressing a severe mental health crisis at a moment when most of the institutions that would be able to deal with it are pretty broken. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of psychedelic enthusiasts who think that this is our chance to not only transform mental health care, but to transform society in the process.
Right.
And I talk about some of those sort of self-proclaimed psychonauts in the article, and I think that they are perfectly legitimate in thinking that these drugs bear real potential for transforming mental health care. I think the reason that psychedelics are going to be legal, however, is simply that there are enough very wealthy investors and enough very large corporations that
Hmm.
are interested in capitalizing on the current crisis with better drugs. And so
Yeah.
in the article, I talk about them sort of being like, Medicare Part C plans or Medicare
Right.
Advantage plans, right? It's just like it's a business opportunity embedded within a failing public system.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe talk a little bit more about that. Like, how does the psychedelic renaissance, so to speak, kind of fit into our current, broader healthcare system? Like, why is our healthcare system basically set up right now to enable this psychedelic rollout to happen?
Sure. I mean, I think that listeners to the Jacobin show will know about the sort of broader absurdities of the American healthcare system. I do kind of think that mental health care has a particular history that makes it not just an effect of the fact that we don't have Medicare for all, but
Yeah.
something sort of much more particular, and that has to do with the so-called biological revolution in psychiatry. I mean, sort of put briefly, beginning in the 60s, roughly, there was a move against the dominant psychoanalytic regime in psychiatry, away from talk therapy and towards the use of different drugs,
Hmm.
sort of typically doled out in much shorter sessions than the psychoanalysts were used to. And from the perspective of insurance companies, this is a no-brainer, right?
Hmm.
To be able to see someone, to give them a pill rather than hour-long therapy sessions a few times a week, it's a lot cheaper. So it
Yeah.
makes sense from their perspective. Um, but the specifics of the drug development process also play a role here. The way in which like drug research happens, it's not really about finding cures. They're looking for chronic forms of treatment, again, because it makes them money, right? If they just
Yeah.
gave you one pill to fix a problem, it's not as lucrative for them as having maintenance medications. And so the kinds of drugs that they were interested in were drugs that, were marginally better than the alternatives. In the case of the SSRIs and the SRNIs, it's really pretty marginal. And I think that we're sort of at the point where, even the people who really thought Prozac was the brain drug of the 90s are questioning its overall efficacy. So, I mean, it's those specifics, it's really, the profit motive at the end of the day, that have made the drugs that are doled out for mental health treatment pretty bad in comparison to what it could be. I mean, there is a whole community of psychonauts out there. You can read about them on erowid.org, who have been experimenting with all sorts of novel substances over the years. And it's not just MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, whatever, that bear curative potential. There are an infinite range of synthetic substances out there that I think eventually, if the current trends continue, will be on the market.
So I suppose that gets us to the question of what the psychedelic rollout could look like. Basically, after legalization, how do you think, or how does it seem like large pharmaceutical companies are sort of positioning themselves right now to kind of capitalize on that legalization?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that it seems like all of the trends are pointing in the direction of medical legalization
Hmm.
imminently. So there's a recent Health and Human Services report that talked about the sort of imminent legalization of MDMA and psilocybin treatments, like within roughly 2 years' time. I think MDMA is probably going to be out before psilocybin. It's scheduled for like a kind of 2023 FDA approval. Um, I'm sorry, say the question one more time, Jen.
Just curious how big pharmaceutical companies thus far have been sort of positioning themselves to kind of capitalize on eventual legalization.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. So there's big well-known pharmaceutical companies like Johnson and Johnson that
Yeah.
are investing. They have a nasal spray called Spravato, which is sort of essentially like one isomer of ketamine that's out for the treatment of depression. But there's also sort of large market disruptors as well. Compass, MindMed. Peter Thiel is behind Compass, or he's one investor in Compass Pharmaceuticals. And so there's a lot of companies that are very interested in this. It seems like the way in which they want to roll it out is essentially to renew the existing system, but just with different and in many cases better drugs, right?
Yeah.
So not to change the practice of psychiatry, not to challenge the bottom line of insurance companies in any way, but essentially to take a class of drugs that is not working that well and to just replace them with a new class of drugs. This is very much in opposition to what many psychedelic enthusiasts are hoping for, which is not just a change of drugs, but a change of the modality of therapy, to sort of think about mental health care provision in a radically different way. Now, right now, those two forces are aligned, the big companies and the psychedelic enthusiasts, but it does sort of seem like eventually it's going to break in one way, that the company's model is going to win out, given their power over the market.
Yeah, I want to wrap up kind of on that question. And this is something that I think you've been sort of alluding to throughout the talk, and this comes up in your piece. So, on the one hand, we've got like Big Pharma, right? And then on the other hand, you have kind of these psychedelic enthusiasts, right? Or I think you call them the true believers at one point in your piece, who genuinely sort of envision these drugs as a form of treatment that, as you had said, can kind of go beyond the constraints of psychiatry under capitalism. Now, I think, it's easy to think of these two groups in opposition, but something that comes up in your piece is that, as you just noted, like there is a kind of alignment between the two. So maybe talk a little bit, just to wrap up, about how the kind of enthusiasm of the true believers has maybe inadvertently ended up enabling this new kind of capitalist psychedelic gold rush.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, we live in a time where people are hyper vigilant about the different kinds of snake oils being peddled
Yeah,
today. There are an infinite number of kinds of like quick fixes on the market. People sort of like proclaiming that like, this is the thing, right?
yeah,
And especially when it comes from the top down, when it comes from people like Peter Thiel, or when it comes from like biotech executives, it's just not very convincing. Like
right.
they're not very convincing in in making the case to people that this is the one thing. And so as a result, I think Americans are increasingly paranoid given the kind of things that that are peddled to them. In the case of psychedelics, people like Peter Thiel don't need to write the copy.
Hmm.
They can rely upon this very enthusiastic group of psychedelic researchers and users to sort of tout the product for them. And just to be clear, like I think that those psychedelic researchers have good reason for their enthusiasm. I
Right.
think that when it comes to addressing PTSD, anxiety, depression. Like these are drugs with real potential, or at least they're better than sort of what's on the market today. So I don't think that they're wrong to be enthusiastic. The sort of contradiction that I point to at the end of the article is that they're essentially like running cover for this emerging big psych complex. And it's a difficult position to be in. On the one hand, they want what's better for their patients. On the other hand, they're very much playing into existing market trends.
Yeah. All right. Ben Fong's latest piece for Jacobin again is The Psychedelic Renaissance is on the verge of an uneasy enlightenment. We will be linking that down below. Ben, thanks for your time. It was great to see you as always.
Thanks so much, Jen. You too.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.